Welcome to Philbits, where we explore specific themes, ideas, and arguments in the history of philosophy. These YouTube episodes are brought to you by philosophy2.com. My name is Dr. Todd Mei, and in this episode, I'll be providing you with a primer to normative ethics. So let's get started. Most of us are probably familiar with the idea of ethics. It's making decisions in terms of what's right and wrong as situations arise. So why add the term normative in front of ethics? Well, we can think about normativity according to two basic features. The first is action guidance. And action guidance has to do with understanding what actions are right and what actions are wrong, and ideally understanding why such actions are right or wrong. Now, when we come across different moral theories, we'll be understanding action guidance according to three general areas, and that has to do first with criteria. So what criteria are we looking at to determine what actions are right and wrong? How do we justify whether or not an action is right or wrong? So you can think about an instance where you might take a certain action like helping somebody across the road and someone asks, why did you do that? If you can provide an account as to why you think that was a right action, that is a form of justification. And the third concern that we come across with moral theories is rational consistency. So rational consistency is the idea that given similar situations, you'll be acting ethically in the same way. You won't be inconsistent acting one way and in another situation doing the opposite. The second basic feature of normativity is the moral community. So all moral actors and agents, in other words you, belong to a specific moral community which provides resources for determining what's right or wrong, what virtues are, what might be admirable, what might be shameful or reprehensible. And so it's important to recognize that these communities play a role in the way in which we think about what actions might be right or wrong. And for example, if you were raised in a religious moral community such as Christianity, that's going to have a very strong influence or impact in what you think might be right given a situation with something that concerns lying or obeying or respecting your parents, which might not be the same thing in another moral tradition or perhaps a secular tradition, which might be absent of the idea that lying is somehow prohibited and that you might be able to lie in certain circumstances. So we'll come across iterations of moral communities in the different traditions we look at or the different moral theories. In subsequent episodes, I'll be talking about specific moral theories, their advantages and disadvantages. For now, we just need to know these moral traditions by their names. First, there is utilitarianism and consequentialism. Second, there is deontology, often identified with certain religious traditions or the moral philosopher Immanuel Kant. And third, there is virtue ethics, which is often identified with ancient Athens, so Plato and Aristotle, but it also runs up in the Roman times and different religious traditions as well. Given that we have the three moral traditions, what is important to understand is that each one of them will regard the two basic features of normativity we just discussed in very different ways, and this will have huge implications as to how they understand what right and wrong action is and what criteria we ought to assess or use in order to determine how to act given a situation. Let's now take a step back and ask ourselves, why does ethics matter? Why is it important to study ethics from a philosophical point of view? Well, the dilemma is quite simple. Either you believe that there are universal standards of right and wrong, or you don't. So let's take the latter one first. So if you don't believe there are universal standards of right and wrong, it's kind of an almost anything goes situation. And that's what's often referred to by philosophers as moral relativism. So moral relativism is the idea that every one of us has a different upbringing. We believe differently about what's right or wrong. There may be groups that agree about certain things, but at the end of the day, there's going to be no way to really sort out what's right or wrong. It just comes down to attitudes about what's right or wrong, very thin beliefs about what's right or wrong, or preferences about what is right or what is wrong. So the difficulty of that position, although it seems quite easy to adopt in a practical everyday sense because you just can go about living your life and not be worried about what other people are doing, is that when something bad does happen, it becomes problematic and troubling to sort out exactly how you can make sense of certain things that you might be reacting to as being immoral, other than the fact that you just simply disagree with it. So at the end of the day, that becomes a situation of what Jean-Paul Sartre, the existential philosopher, would call a situation of bad faith. Do you truly believe that there is anything goes, that things are relative in terms of moral beliefs and preferences. If you do, you can't really complain about things that go wrong. The other option, which is probably what most philosophers gravitate towards, is the idea that there is a universal and objective standard of truth. Now, that can mean many different things, but although appealing because it does require that each human being act according to this universal standard of morality, it opens a can of worms, because how do we deal with different cultures? How do we deal with different historical periods? Are all situations alike? Or if they're mostly alike, that still doesn't mean that whatever we determine to be a rule or whatever we determine to be the right conduct in a certain situation doesn't mean that it'll always match. There may be some exceptions. And I think a lot of us find that when we're in these kind of sticky moral situations, there are always these kinds of niggling exceptions that we might want to consider. One of the standard cases or examples is the issue of lying. If you truly believe that lying is wrong, as we'll see with the philosopher Immanuel Kant, what about the situations where you don't tell the truth to somebody because you know it's going to hurt their feelings, or you think the case of a little white lie will actually benefit someone as opposed to telling them the truth because you may think it will cause more harm than it will good? So there are a lot of issues to consider, but let's now talk about the two ways in which moral traditions might approach how to understand universal standards of moral objectivity. There are two approaches that a moral theory can take in general. This is going to be somewhat of an oversimplification, but it'll help to get us started thinking. The first approach is to determine in advance what is objective with regard to what is right and wrong. And there, as we will see, going to be different ways that philosophers think this can be done. The second approach is having ideas of what is right and wrong and working out along the way whether or not these ideas are correct. So in other words, we have a pretty good level of belief or credence in the kinds of values and principles that we use in acting morally in everyday life, but we're not quite certain about it. We're not quite sure, but we're willing to bet on these principles and values, as it were. So as we live our life, we will use these values until there are counterexamples or examples that challenge whether or not our beliefs are right or wrong, and test them. So it's a kind of experimentation model of determining what is right and wrong. So one determines in advance, and the other says, we have a general idea about what might be right or wrong, so let's kind of work it out along the way as we live our life in practice. It's important to note that both of these approaches agree there is an objective or universal standard of morality, but each of them thinks this standard is reached in different ways, and that's going to be crucial. So if you're the kind of person who likes to have as much information as possible and to be as certain as possible, then you're probably going to gravitate towards the first approach. If you are the kind of person that likes to shoot from the hip, as it were, but have a lot of information or sufficient information to go about your daily life, and you recognize that life itself is very complex, then you're probably going to gravitate towards the second approach, because the complexity of life means that not every situation is going to be the same, and you might have a rule for acting in one way, but there might be a situation that allows for some kind of exception. Here are two exercises to help get us thinking in advance about the three moral traditions. And it's the kind of exercise I like to do with my students on the very first day of lecture for the course. And I basically set out a characterization of each moral tradition and have them decide what they think is the most attractive. And then at the end of the course, then they reflect on whether or not their position has changed, given that we've looked at the advantages and disadvantages of each moral theory. And it's quite interesting to see how students have changed and why they have changed. So here's the first exercise. Both are multiple choice questions. When it comes to a standard of what is right and wrong, do you think A, there is a universal and objective standard of what counts as right and wrong, regardless of historical and cultural variation? B, moral standards are purely a function of what an individual or group believes, and there is no way to sort things out. And C, there is a universal and objective standard, but we're simply not in a situation to know what this is, given how situations vary historically and culturally. So let's turn to the table to see where the different moral traditions lie. So if you're concerned about universality and objectivity, you can see that deontology, especially Kant's version of it, and utilitarianism and consequentialism are going to be the moral traditions that will pique your interest. If you are of the middle option, B, of moral relativism, although you could get a version of virtue ethics which is morally relative, most virtue ethicists don't really commit to the idea of moral relativism. But of the three traditions, virtue ethics is the one that veers closest towards the moral relativism pole, because it does recognize that the resources for determining what's right and wrong are strongly anchored or embedded in our own moral communities. And that's going to be non-negotiable for most virtue ethicists. You can't step outside your moral community to determine what's right or wrong. So it's kind of a first-person perspective approach to determining what might be universal. If you really care about context and how situations may vary as they arise in everyday life, then virtue ethics is going to be the moral theory you'll find most interesting, especially with its emphasis on this faculty of reasoning called practical wisdom or practical reasoning. In the Greek, it's called phronesis, which is the key faculty which allows us to assess situations, compare them, and apply rules or principles to determine what we ought to do. And there are versions of utilitarianism and consequentialism which fit within a context-dependent situation, and it will depend upon how utilitarian or consequentialist theory takes into account what might be measurable or not measurable according to standards of happiness or utility. And famously, Kant's philosophy is criticized for not being context sensitive, but as we'll see, Kant does allow for a way in which we can think about how his philosophy does respond to context, and it's going to depend a lot on how we understand his metaphysics and epistemology. The second exercise: when it comes to ethical situations where you have to choose what to do in view of what you believe to be right, do you prefer A, to be told what to do by another person you trust or recognize as a moral authority, B, to understand the reasons for actions and why an action you believe to be right is, in fact, right, or C, to assess each situation on a case-by-case method, but you think each situation varies by context? Looking at the table, if you're the kind of person that would rather just be told what is right and wrong and just go on about it, then utilitarianism and consequentialism does offer a lot of advantages for you. And we'll be looking specifically at John Stuart Mill's version of utilitarianism, where it relies on a sort of calculation and measurement, as well as the advice of people who know best about what counts as pleasure and happiness. Kant's philosophy is also another option, although he insists that moral reasoning is not about what's being told. The benefit of Kant's philosophy is that through a process of moral reasoning, you can work out in advance what your duties are given a situation. And so a lot of these duties are ones that you cannot avoid, you can't just ignore. So if you work out what these duties are, then you have a pretty good idea of how you're going to act in daily life. And one of the big controversial ones for Kant is, of course, that you should never tell a lie, and that is non-negotiable. So there you have something that, although not told to you because you work out that's the right thing to do, it's set in stone, as it were, and so you can you have some definite guideposts in which by which you can live your life. And virtue ethics is probably the least reliant on being told what to do. It does rely on traditions, understanding how virtues work and so forth, but those are always questionable and always open to examination given how certain situations may change or vary. If you really like to understand not only what a right action is, but why it's right, then theoretically speaking, Kant has a rather rigorous method that's referred to in terms of the categorical imperative or the test of universalization, by which you can determine whether or not your motive or your reason for action or your duty in a particular case is actually rational. And by rational, Kant would understand that to mean correct or right, as we will see. So there is a process by which one can determine how to do things with Kant's philosophy, and it tends to be mind-boggling for a lot of students, but also very intricate, extensive, and systematic, and very attractive for that reason for philosophically minded people. Understanding why an action is right, virtue ethics really takes that seriously, and it relies upon the faculty of reasoning I referred to earlier as practical reasoning, practical wisdom, or the Greek phronesis, to really weigh up options, values, context, people, given the situation, and to see what the best decision might be. And a classic example I like to give to my students is that you can have two virtue ethicists who are vegetarian, and they might be at a meal where a host, not knowing that they're vegetarian, serves them a meat dish or non-vegetarian dish, and one virtue ethicist might choose to eat the meal, and another virtue ethicist might choose not to eat the meal because different processes of reasoning are involved, different criteria are called on, and different decisions are made in the end. Now that sounds very interesting, but also it sounds very problematic because it seems to open the door to what I referred to earlier as moral relativism, or the idea that what you decide to be right or wrong just depends on your own preferences or attitudes. So although there is a process of understanding what might be right or wrong with virtue ethics, it does have to address this elephant in the room of moral relativism, or the threat of reducing to moral relativism. Consequentialism, utilitarianism tends to be the least in favor of understanding or using a process of reasoning to understand what is right or wrong. It tends to rely on a calculus and values determined in advance, or that can be easily applied in a situation. And it tends to bracket a lot of other questions that might arise with respect to why we're deciding to make a decision in that way. And finally, looking at the third option, if we assess each situation on a case-by-case scenario, we find virtue ethics to be in the front in that. It really emphasizes that. And as I mentioned, Kant's philosophy does allow for sensitivity to context, and utilitarianism, consequentialism also allows for sensitivity and context depending on how one understands the calculus for determining the greatest good for a society. And we will see there are a lot of open questions about that utilitarian theories are either modest about or simply try to disregard as being irrelevant. So that's it for the primer on normative ethics. I hope it's piqued your interest. Obviously, I think it's a very interesting, intriguing, and important subject to study, not just for philosophy students, but for everyone. It's important for everyone to get an idea about the different moral traditions which constitute the ways we think generally about making decisions in an ethical domain. And also it provides an idea of the different ways in which we might justify how we are acting or other people are acting, and open up a larger conversation about the kinds of things that are involved in treating people as moral equals. So in the next few episodes, we're going to be looking at the different moral traditions of utilitarianism, consequentialism, according to John Stuart Mill's theory, of deontology according to Kant's moral philosophy, and virtue ethics according to Aristotle's ethics. Until then, I'll see you next time. If you've liked this video, please share, subscribe, and review. Thank you.